Hey everyone, welcome back. Ever feel like training data is taking over your life, but you're still not quite sure if those programs are actually, making a difference? Trust me, you are not alone.
Not at all.
Today, we are diving headfirst into that very challenge. We're going way past those smiley face surveys and getting down to the nitty-gritty
All right.
of truly effective training evaluation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We're cracking open Chapter 16 of Applied Psychology and Talent Management, and we're going to uncover why so many companies just miss the mark when they try to measure how well their training is actually working.
Yeah.
Get ready for some surprising stats,
Yes.
real-world examples,
Absolutely.
and even a military case study with a twist ending. You do not want to miss this.
Yeah.
But before we get all tactical, let's set the scene.
Okay. So it is kind of mind-boggling when you think about the sheer volume of training methods out there. You've got everything from microlearning to like full-on immersive simulations.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Yet research suggests there's this disconnect. Most companies aren't systematically figuring out if those methods are they actually like leading to real tangible results.
So it's like having a garage full of every tool imaginable, but no blueprint.
Precisely. And the numbers really back it up. One study found that only 22%, that's only 22% of L&D pros felt like they actually had enough data to confidently judge if their training was effective.
Wow.
It often seems like the focus is on the shiniest, latest tech, things like all those fancy talent development platforms, TDL, anyone. But it's not really about the tech itself. It's about whether it's actually driving any kind of meaningful change. Right?
Oh, the shiny new toy syndrome. I get it. The new tech is exciting, but not if it's just adding more noise to the mix. So if we're not just collecting those happy face feedback forms at the end of a session, what does good measurement actually look like?
Well, it's all about approaching evaluation through a bunch of different lenses, not just one. Think of it like you would when you're, assessing a restaurant, right? You wouldn't just look at the menu, would you?
No way. The ambiance matters. The service.
Yeah,
The actual food.
exactly. It's about the whole experience. And it's the same with training. We need to look at it from multiple angles to really get the full picture.
Okay, so what are the different lenses we should be using for training evaluation?
Well, one of the most important distinctions is thinking about internal versus external criteria. So imagine you're doing some training on, let's say, equal employment opportunity.
Right, EO. Yeah.
So an internal measure of that training might be something like, how well did your team score on a quiz about the material? Did they grasp the concepts?
Okay, makes sense, but that's just step one, right? Just
Yeah.
because I can pass a test on EEO guidelines doesn't mean I'm actually following them out in the real world.
Right. And that's where the external criteria come in. That's where you're looking at how their actual behavior changes on the job.
Yeah.
Are they putting those EEO principles into practice in their everyday interactions, in their decision-making, just in their overall conduct in the workplace? That's the real difference between knowledge and application.
Okay, I love that distinction. So it's not just about acing the test. It's about whether that training is actually changing how people show up at work. Both are important, but that external lens feels extra crucial. What else do we need to consider?
We also can't forget about qualitative versus quantitative data.
Ooh, yes, the numbers versus the stories.
Exactly. Numbers are fantastic for tracking things like completion rates or maybe your ROI.
Right, the hard data.
Yes, but they don't always tell the whole story.
It's like my fitness tracker. It might tell me I walked 10,000 steps today, but it doesn't tell me if I enjoyed the walk or if I saw something amazing along the way or...
Precisely. It's the qualitative data, those stories, the participant feedback, observations of how the training is being used, even just anecdotal stories of success. That gives you those rich insights into why something worked or why it didn't. And unfortunately, a lot of L&D teams can get really stuck chasing the numbers.
Because the numbers feel safe and concrete.
They do.
But sometimes the real magic is in the why behind those numbers.
Absolutely. And then we also have formative and summative evaluation.
Okay, break those down for us.
All right. So think of formative evaluation like a test run of your program. So you're getting feedback during the development process to spot any areas for improvement before it's fully baked. Summative evaluation, that happens at the end. You're assessing whether those learning objectives were actually achieved.
So formative evaluation is like getting feedback on a rough draft, and then summative evaluation is grading the final paper.
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it. And by using all these different evaluation types together, internal and external, qualitative, quantitative, formative, summative, that's how we start to gain a much deeper understanding of our training's true impact.
we're getting that holistic view, not just putting all our eggs in one basket. This is already making me rethink how we do things.
Yeah.
But we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention the granddaddy of all evaluation models, Kirkpatrick's 4 levels. I will be honest, I thought I had a handle on this one. But after really digging into this chapter, I'm realizing there's way more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, yes. Kirkpatrick. It's funny because his model is so widely known, but also so often misunderstood.
Really?
It's like that super popular song that everyone knows the chorus to.
But not the verses.
Exactly. Nobody knows the verses. But the verses are where all the really important nuances are.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What are we missing?
Well, for starters, Kirkpatrick's model, as great as it is, it's starting to show its age a little bit. It's based on this kind of like simpler view of learning that doesn't always line up with the complexities of how we actually learn and use knowledge in like today's world. Right?
So it's like trying to use a rotary phone to navigate the metaverse. A little outdated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also can oversimplify some of the key concepts, like take trainee reactions, for example.
Okay.
Haven't you ever had that training? You're like, I really didn't enjoy that, but you still managed to walk away with some useful knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. Happens all the time.
Kirkpatrick's models doesn't quite capture that nuance.
It doesn't allow for the I hated it, but I learned something reaction.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so a one-size-fits-all approach to reactions isn't going to cut it. What else should we be wary of?
I think the biggest misconception out there is that Kirkpatrick's 4 levels are this, like strict hierarchy,
Yeah.
that level 4, which is results, that's always the gold standard, the be-all and end-all.
Right, right.
But in reality, the most important level really depends on what your goal is for the evaluation in the first place.
Okay.
Sometimes just understanding those immediate reactions, level 1, that's enough.
Yeah.
Other times, you might need to actually track those long-term behavioral changes, that's level 3, to really know if the training stuck. It all depends.
So it's not a ladder to climb, it's more like a toolbox.
Yes. A toolbox. I love that.
You choose the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
And the right tool might be different for every single training program. Okay, this is eye-opening.
It's about choosing the right evaluation approach, and sometimes, as you've alluded to, that means being able to show the value of your training in those hard, cold numbers.
Yes, especially when you're trying to get buy-in from leadership or justify budget,
Exactly.
Got to speak their language.
Speak the language of numbers, right?
Okay.
And that often leads us to ROI.
Ah, yes, ROI, the holy grail, but also notoriously tricky to actually pin down.
It can be very elusive.
So how do we wrangle it? Spill the tea.
Well, how do you put an actual dollar figure on, improved teamwork or a boost in employee morale?
All right.
Some of these benefits, while they're incredibly valuable,
They're hard to quantify.
hard to quantify. You can't just slap a number on it.
The feel-good factor doesn't always translate neatly onto a spreadsheet.
Exactly. Plus, those traditional ROI calculations, they tend to have these, blinders on.
Okay.
They focus on just one training program in isolation, right? But in reality, all your talent development efforts, they're all working together. It's a whole system.
So it's like judging a car engine without considering the transmission, the wheels,
Yes.
the whole shebang.
The whole ecosystem. That's a great analogy. And that's where utility analysis comes in.
Utility analysis. Okay.
Utility analysis. It tries to take a broader approach.
Yeah.
It's still trying to give you a concrete picture of your training's impact, but it's trying to account for some of those less tangible benefits as well.
Okay. Utility analysis. It sounds very promising, but maybe also a tad intimidating.
I know, it sounds very official and maybe a little bit scary.
Yeah.
It does involve a formula.
Uh-oh.
But don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in the math today, I promise. The main thing to remember is that it tries to consider a wider range of factors. Things like, were errors reduced? Did we save time? How about improvements in employee retention? All things that really impact that bottom line.
So instead of just being able to say, this program made our employees happier, which is great,
Which is great.
we can say, this program reduced errors by X%, which saved us Y dollars.
Yes.
That's music to a CFO's ears.
Music to their ears.
Yeah.
And speaking of tangible impact, there was this fascinating 4-year study that really highlights the power of this approach.
Are you talking about the one where they analyzed 18 different training programs?
That's the one. And they found that on average, just training in general led to a 17% improvement in performance. Pretty impressive, right?
That sounds like a pretty good deal. Sign me up for all the training. But I'm guessing there's a but coming.
There's always a but. Here's the thing. When they dug a little deeper, they found these huge variations in ROI.
Okay.
Some programs had just, like, off-the-charts returns. Like one-time management training had a 2,000% ROI.
2,000. Okay, talk about a return on your investment. That's incredible. That's proof that the right training can be pure gold.
It can be. But it also highlights this really important point. Not all training programs are created equal.
Right.
Right. They also found a big difference in the ROI between, like, managerial training programs and things like sales or technical training.
Oh, interesting. What were the numbers there?
So sales and technical training programs, on average, they had an ROI of 418%.
Wow.
Managerial training clocked in at 45%.
Wow. So not to say that managerial training isn't valuable, but it might require a different kind of approach, a different evaluation approach to really demonstrate its impact.
Exactly. Sometimes those less tangible benefits, things like improved leadership or better communication, they're just as crucial, even though they don't have that clear dollar sign attached to them.
It really is all about choosing the right lens for the job, just like we were talking about earlier. But sometimes, even with the best of intentions, those numbers, they just don't tell the whole story. And I'm thinking back to that military case study we talked about earlier.
Oh, the one with the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yes. It's a great example of how relying solely on self-reported data, it can be a slippery slope.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
That study is like a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
It just really underscores the need for multiple perspectives
Yeah.
and really rigorous evaluation methods.
Okay, so for all of our listeners out there who are maybe thinking, okay, this is all great, but I'm not exactly running training programs for the IDF.
Right.
What are some practical takeaways, especially if you're working with maybe limited resources or you've got time constraints? What can you actually do?
Well, that's where understanding these things called quasi-experimental designs can be a real game changer.
Quasi-experimental designs. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating, I'm not going to lie.
I know that sounds very fancy and complicated.
Are we talking like advanced statistical analysis here? Because I got to be honest,
Not at all.
math is not my forte.
I promise, it's much simpler than it sounds. Think of them as the agile, more flexible cousin of those traditional, very rigid experiments.
Okay, so we're not statisticians, but we can borrow some tools from their world, right? Give us the lay of the land. What are some of these quasi-experimental designs, and how do they actually work out in the real world?
Absolutely. Let's start with a really simple one. It's called the time series design.
Okay.
It's basically about tracking those data points over time, but you're doing it for a single group, both before and after the training.
Okay.
And that helps you isolate the impact of the training by showing you, like, did anything noticeable shift in their performance that lines up with when that training happened?
So if we were measuring something like, I don't know, customer satisfaction scores or even like internal employee productivity, we would ideally want to see some sort of upswing right after the training wraps up.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you're looking for. It's a really good way to see, did the training actually move the needle on those key metrics?
Okay.
Now, another one that's really useful is the non-equivalent control group design.
Okay.
And here, you're actually comparing your training group to another group that didn't get the training.
Gotcha.
The catch is the groups aren't randomly assigned, which means you have to be a little bit careful and think about any differences that might already exist between those two groups.
That makes sense. Like if one group already had way more experience in a certain area or a higher skill level going in, that could really throw things off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even with those limitations, it can still give you some really valuable information, especially if you're combining it with other data points. Now, for those times when you've only got one group to work with and you really want to get super specific about the training's impact, there's the non-equivalent dependent variable design.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, but potentially brain bending as well. Break it down for us.
It's so much simpler than it sounds, I promise. So instead of comparing different groups, you're comparing different outcomes, but within the same group.
Okay.
So let's say you're doing like a training on active listening skills, right?
Yeah.
You would measure not only their active listening skills before and after, but you'd also measure something else that's totally unrelated, like maybe their data entry speed or something.
Ah, I see. So if the training is actually effective, you would expect to see improvement in their active listening skills, but not necessarily in like how fast they can enter data.
Yes.
It's like a built-in control within the same group of people.
Exactly. And that helps isolate the specific effect of just the training itself, even if you don't have that separate control group.
That's really clever.
And then finally, we've got those ongoing training programs, the ones that happen on like a regular cycle. For those, There's the institutional cycle design, which
Okay.
is all about using each training cohort as a control group for the next one.
So like a relay race where each runner is passing the baton of data on to the next?
I love that analogy. Yes. And by comparing data across all those different cohorts over time, you can start to control for some of those other external factors that might be changing in the background.
Go.
Things like company policy updates or even like just those broader economic shifts that might be going on.
This is incredibly helpful. I'm already thinking about ways that we can apply this. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to acknowledge that data is only one part of the story, right?
It is.
Sometimes a result can be statistically significant, but it doesn't necessarily translate into some kind of meaningful real-world change.
Right. And that's what we call the difference between statistical significance and practical significance.
Like that.
Right. Because you can have all the data in the world showing your training led to this tiny little improvement, and statistically it's significant.
Yeah.
But if it didn't actually change anything about how people do their jobs, then is it really all that useful?
It's like that saying, don't sweat the small stuff. Sometimes a small statistical blip isn't worth overhauling your entire training program.
Exactly. Focus on the changes that make a real difference. And we need to ask ourselves, did this training actually lead to things like increased productivity? Did it improve customer satisfaction? Were there fewer safety incidents? Those are the things that really, truly matter. And that's where understanding effect size can be really, really helpful.
Effect size. Okay, tell us more.
So basically, it's telling you about the magnitude of that change.
Okay.
So a big effect size, that means your training had a big impact. A small effect size, not so much. But it helps you to prioritize, like, what are the changes that are really meaningful?
So it's not just about whether or not the training worked, but how well it worked and what tangible difference did it actually make.
Exactly. And speaking of making a difference, let's not forget the power of just good old common sense.
Yes.
We can get so caught up in all the data and the numbers and the analysis that we forget to just ask, does this actually make sense? And that's where logical analysis comes in.
Logical analysis. It sounds so obvious, but I have a feeling it's often overlooked.
All the time. It's really just about taking a step back from all those numbers and thinking about the bigger picture. Were the goals of this training even clear in the first place?
Right.
Were they lined up with what the organization actually needs? And did anything weird happen during the training or even out in the workplace that might have influenced these results that we're seeing?
So, like, if a company went through a major reorganization right before the training, that could throw everyone off.
Exactly. Or maybe there was a technology glitch that totally disrupted the flow of the training. Or, maybe there was a key stakeholder who just wasn't on board with the training from the very beginning.
Right.
Those things matter.
It's about connecting the dots between the training itself, the data, and what's actually happening in the real world.
Exactly. When we can combine those data-driven insights with logical analysis, with just a little bit of common sense, that's how we can make smarter decisions about our training programs.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've leveled up my toolkit, and I am ready to tackle those tough questions about the training programs that we're running. Before we go, any final words of wisdom for our listeners out there?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. Evaluating training effectiveness isn't about trying to find one single right answer. It's about using the right tools, asking those really good, insightful questions, and being open to what you find, even if it's unexpected. When we embrace that curiosity, that's when training can really unlock its true potential and drive meaningful change.
Beautifully said. A huge thanks to you for being here, for sharing all of your expertise with us. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of training evaluation. Remember, even small steps toward more effective evaluation, they can lead to really big wins for your organization. Until next time, happy training, everyone.